midnight in the high desert of Utah. The wind here doesn't just blow, it scours. It kicks up a fine white dust that coats the back of your throat with the taste of ancient brine and poison. A century ago, this dead landscape was the Coney Island of the West, a pleasure palace built on stilts where the music never stopped and the water was so thick with salt a human being could not sink. It was an impossibility, a Moorish fantasy of onion domes and minarets hovering over a lake that nothing could survive in. But the Great Salt Lake is a fickle god. It burned the palace down twice, then it flooded the ruins, and then it simply walked away. Today, the water is vanishing, leaving behind a ghost resort and a cloud of arsenic dust that threatens to poison the city that bears its name. Is this place a monument to human resilience? Or is it a warning that you cannot build a paradise on a dying sea? Chapter 1. The Mormon Coney Island. To understand the madness of Saltair, you have to understand the psychological state of Utah in 1893. The territory was fighting for legitimacy. For decades, the Mormon pioneers had been isolated, viewed by the rest of America as a strange theocracy in the desert. But by the 1990s, the church had officially ended polygamy. Statehood was on the horizon. Utah wanted to prove it was modern, it was civilized, it was American. And nothing says American like a massive commercialized amusement park. The idea was proposed by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints itself. They looked at the Great Salt Lake, a hostile, smelly, mosquito-ridden body of water 15 miles from the city, and saw potential. They didn't want the rough, booze-soaked bathing resorts that had popped up on the South Shore, places like Black Rock or Garfield Beach, where miners and non-Mormons drank whiskey and gambled. The church wanted a sanitized alternative, a Mormon Coney Island. They hired architect Richard K.A. Kledding. Kledding was a visionary who would later design the Utah State Capitol, but for this project, he looked east, far east. He sketched a design that had no business in the American West. It wasn't a log cabin, it wasn't a frontier saloon, it was a Moorish palace. The scale was audacious. The main pavilion would be 1,200 feet long. The central dome would rise 130 feet into the air, taller than the Salt Lake Temple at the time. But the real challenge wasn't the style, it was the foundation. You cannot pour concrete into a lake bed that shifts like quicksand. To build a castle on water, they needed a forest. 2,500 wooden pilings were shipped in. Each piling was 10 inches in diameter. They were steam-driven deep into the hard pan, a layer of salt and clay beneath the mud. The entire resort would hover exactly 4 feet above the water surface. It cost $350,000 in 1893 currency. Adjusted for inflation, that is a multi-million-dollar gamble on a lake that smelled like rotten eggs. But when it opened on May 30th, 1893, the gamble paid off. Chapter 2. A City on Stilts. Getting there was half the theater. You boarded a train in Salt Lake City, escaping the coal smoke in the summer heat. The Saltair Railway ran due west, cutting through the marshes until the land simply ended. For the last 4,000 feet of the journey, the train tracks left the ground. They ran on a wooden trestle built directly over the water. Passengers looked out the window and saw nothing but waves. It felt as if the train was floating. When the train hissed to a halt at the depot, you stepped out into a different world. The air was cooler here, but heavy. The smell was intense, a mixture of brine, algae, and the carnival scents of popcorn and roasted peanuts. The main centerpiece was the dance floor. It was an engineering marvel in its own right. Cledding had designed it without a single central pillar, using a roof truss system to keep the floor wide open. It could hold 5,000 dancers at once. Imagine the sound. 10,000 shoes shuffling on hardwood, and a live orchestra playing waltzes that echoed under the massive dome, the sound of the waves lapping against the pilings beneath the floorboards. But the main attraction was the water itself. The Great Salt Lake is a remnant of Lake Bonneville, a prehistoric sea that covered much of Utah. Because it has no outlet, minerals flow in but never leave. The water is saturated with salt, between 15% and 27% salinity, depending on the year. For comparison, the ocean is about 3.5%. This created a sensation called the float. You couldn't sink if you tried. The water pushed you up. It felt oily, thick. Families would bob like corks in the heavy surf, but there was a price for this miracle. If you got the water in your eyes, it burned like acid. If you swallowed it, you would retch for hours. And when you got out, you didn't just dry off, you crystallized. As the water evaporated from your skin, it left a layer of fine white salt. You became a statue. The resort had to pump fresh water in from the mountains just so people could shower the lake off their bodies. At night, Saltair was the brightest thing in the desert. The church, initially wary of electricity, illuminated the outline of the domes with thousands of incandescent bulbs. From the city, 15 miles away, it looked like a spaceship had landed on the dark water. It was the Lady of the Lake, and for 30 years she reigned. Chapter 3: The First Inferno, 1925. But wood, seasoned by salt and baked by the desert sun, changes. It dries out. It becomes brittle. It becomes tinder. April 22nd, 1925, a Wednesday evening. The resort was being prepared for the summer season. The winter had been dry. The pilings, soaked in creosote to prevent rot, were essentially massive matchsticks waiting for a spark. The official report says the fire started in the scullery, the kitchen area. But rumors persisted. A careless cigarette, a disgruntled employee. Whatever the cause, the chemistry of the building took over. The flames moved with terrifying speed. Remember, this was a structure built over water, but the water couldn't help. The flames climbed the wooden trusswork of the dance floor. They raced up the curve of the onion domes. Witnesses in Salt Lake City looked west and saw the sky turn orange. The giant racer roller coaster, a wooden lattice of tracks that had thrilled millions, caught fire. It didn't just burn, it roared. The structure collapsed into the brine with a hiss of steam that sounded like a dying beast. When the sun rose on April 23rd, the palace was gone. The grand dome had collapsed into the brine. All that remained were thousands of charred black stumps sticking out of the gray water, smoking in the morning air. Here is the twist. The church, usually so prudent with business, had insured the contents of the resort, but the structure itself, the millions of dollars of woodwork, was underinsured. The loss was catastrophic. It should have ended there. The lake had reclaimed its territory, but Salt Lake City wasn't ready to let go of the dream. Chapter 4: Resurrection and Ruin. They rebuilt it, of course they did. But Saltair II, which opened in 1926, was a different beast. New investors poured money into a structure that was sturdier, using more steel, but it lacked the delicate fantasy of the original. And they had a new enemy, not fire, but water. Specifically, the lack of it. The Great Salt Lake is a shallow saucer. Its average depth is only about 14 feet. This means that a drop in water level of just a few feet can move the shoreline by a mile. In the 1930s, a drought cycle began. The lake started to retreat. Imagine the humiliation. You build a lakeside resort, you advertise the float, and then the lake walks away. By 1933, the water was a mile from the pavilion. To fix this, the resort owners built a comical little railway, a makeshift trolley that ferried bathers from the main building across the stinking mud flats to the receding water. The magic was breaking. The city on stilts was now a city on mud. The smell of the exposed lake bed, decaying organic matter decomposing in the sun, began to permeate the dance floor. Chapter 5: The Deserted Playground. Then came the Great Depression, then World War II. Gas rationing meant people couldn't drive out to the lake. The trains stopped running as frequently. The resort, once the jewel of the West, began to rot. By the late 1950s, Saltair was closed. It stood abandoned in the desert. This is the era that cemented its reputation as a haunted place. For a decade, it sat silent. The wind whistled through the broken windows of the bathhouses. Teenagers would break in on a dare, walking the creaky floorboards of the massive dance hall. They told stories of the ghost of the lake, a woman in a white dress who supposedly drowned in the 1920s, seen dancing alone in the empty ballroom. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the building was dying. The salt air was eating the nails. The sun was bleaching the wood. It was a carcass. In 1968, the resort was briefly used as a set for a horror movie, Carnival of Souls. The director didn't have to dress the set. The peeling paint, the isolation, the overwhelming sense of dread. It was all real. The movie captures Saltair in its final tragic state, a grand, rotting corpse waiting for the end. And the end, as it always does in the desert, came with fire. Chapter 6: The Second Fire. 1970. November 1970. The pavilion had been standing silent for 12 years. It was a rotten carcass of wood and peeling paint inhabited only by pigeons and the occasional drifter seeking shelter from the desert wind. But a structure built of timber, soaked in brine and dried in the high desert sun for 70 years, does not decay gracefully. It waits. The fire started in the center of the dance floor. Arson investigators would later say it was deliberate. A match dropped into a pile of oily rags, but there were no suspects, no arrests, just a final, violent execution of the resort. Because of the location, isolated on the mud flats, fire trucks couldn't reach the heart of the blaze quickly. They stopped at the edge of the trestle and watched. The flames were visible from the foothills of the Wasatch Mountains, 15 miles away. Residents of Salt Lake City stepped out onto their porches and watched the orange glow pulse in the west. They knew what it was. The Lady of the Lake was dying. By morning, there was nothing left. The onion domes, the grand entryway, the massive roof truss system, vaporized. All that remained were the pilings. Thousands of charred, black wooden spikes jutting out of the mud like the teeth of a dead leviathan. For the next decade, this was the only monument to the dream, a graveyard of burnt wood. The state of Utah tried to clean it up, but the mud made heavy machinery impossible, so they left it. The ruins became a jagged scar on the horizon, a warning that nature eventually claims everything back. Chapter 7, Saltair 3. The curse continues. You would think, after 2 fires and a receding lake, that investors would learn the lesson, do not build here. But the memory of the glory days was too seductive. In 1981, a new group of developers decided to try for a 3rd time. They called it Saltair 3, but they didn't build a new pavilion. They bought a surplus aircraft hangar from Hill Air Force Base, a massive corrugated metal shed, and moved it to the site. They painted it yellow. They added faux onion domes of fiberglass. It was a caricature of the original. And in a twist of cruel irony, they decided not to build over the water. The lake had been receding for decades, remember. So they built Saltair 3 on dry land a mile from the water, thinking they were safe. But the Great Salt Lake has a sense of humor, a dark one. In 1983, just months after the new resort opened, the weather patterns flipped. A massive El Niño event struck the Pacific. Utah was buried in record snowpack. When spring came, the meltwater rushed down the mountains. The lake didn't just rise, it surged. The statistics of the 1983 flood are staggering. The lake rose 5 feet in a single year. It peaked at 4,212 feet above sea level, a historic high. The volume of water entering the basin was double the average. It caused $200 million in damages across the state. The water that had been a mile away was suddenly knocking at the front door. The new dry land resort was flooded. Investors scrambled. They bought massive pumps. They built a dike around the yellow hangar. For months, the resort was a fortress under siege, surrounded by gray, choppy water. The waves crashed over the go-kart tracks. The picnic areas were submerged. The water eventually receded, but the damage was done. The salt water had corroded the electrical systems. The septic tanks were destroyed. The investors went bankrupt. Saltair 3 sat empty, a yellow tombstone off Interstate 80. The curse wasn't ghosts. The curse was geography. Chapter 8. the toxic future. And now we face the final chapter of the lake's life. And this time, the threat isn't to a building, it is to us. The cycle has reversed again. The lake is shrinking. But it's not just low water, it is an ecological collapse. For 10,000 years, the Great Salt Lake has acted as a drain for the entire region. Every river, every stream flows here. And with that water comes heavy metals from the mountains, residue from mining, runoff from industry, arsenic, mercury, lead, selenium. As long as the lake was full, these toxins were trapped, safely capped by the water and the microbial crust of the lakebed. They were sleeping. But as the water vanishes, the cap is removed. When the wind scours the dry lakebed, it picks up this toxic dust. It creates what scientists call PM 2.5, particulate matter so small it can pass through the lungs and directly into the bloodstream. This isn't science fiction. We have seen this movie before. In the early 1900s, Los Angeles drained Owens Lake in California. It became the single largest source of toxic dust pollution in the United States. It cost billions to mitigate. The Great Salt Lake is 15 times larger than Owens Lake. The dust contains arsenic, a known carcinogen. If the lake dries up completely, the 1.2 million people living in the Salt Lake Valley, families, children, the elderly, will be living in the shadow of a toxic bowl. The Mormon Coney Island sat on top of a chemical bomb, and the fuse is burning. Chapter 9: The Sunset Concerts. Despite the floods, despite the fires, despite the arsenic, the yellow building is still open. Today, Saltair 3 operates as a concert venue. It is perhaps the strangest place in America to see a show. Bands stop here on their cross-country tours. Electronic dance music festivals are held here. Inside, the energy is frantic. The bass rattles the corrugated metal walls. It feels like any other club in the world, but step outside for a cigarette and the illusion shatters. You are standing in a void. There are no streetlights, no neighbors, no trees, just the vast, terrifying silence of the salt flats. It is a liminal space, a threshold. Behind you is the noise of civilization. In front of you is a dead sea that stretches to the horizon. When the concert ends and the last car drives back to the city, the building sits alone in the toxic dark. The Yellow Palace feels less like a venue and more like an outpost on Mars, a stubborn refusal to admit humans don't belong here. Chapter 10: Cinematic Afterlife. This eerie quality, this mixture of joy and death, has made Saltair a star in its own right. Long before the yellow building, when the ruins of the original pavilion were still rotting in the mud, a director named Herc Harvey filmed a low-budget horror movie here called Carnival of Souls. He didn't need special effects. The decaying wood, the endless horizon, the silence. It created an atmosphere of purgatory. In the film, the souls of the damned are drawn to the pavilion. They dance a waltz of the dead in the shattered ballroom. That image stuck. For decades, photographers, directors, and musicians have flocked to the salt flats. They come for the white room aesthetic. The landscape wipes away context. It looks like heaven, or perhaps the end of the world. We are obsessed with the aesthetic of the Great Salt Lake, even as we let it die. We use its corpse as a backdrop for our art. The resort burned down, the water receded, the arsenic is rising. But the image of the pavilion, the idea of a palace on the water, refuses to fade. It haunts the cultural memory of the West. But ghosts are just memories. The smell of the lake, that is real. Chapter 11. The Smell of Decay. If you have never been to the Great Salt Lake, there is one sensory detail that photographs cannot convey. It is the first thing you notice miles before you see the water. The smell. Locals call it lake stink. It's a heavy, sulfurous odor, like boiled eggs left in the sun mixed with rotting seaweed. It's a phantom smell. It doesn't hang over the city every day. It waits for the wind. When the breeze shifts from the northwest, the scent rolls over the valley, penetrating cars and homes. The source is life itself. The lake is too salty for fish, but it is teeming with brine shrimp and brine flies, billions of them. In the late summer, they die. Their tiny bodies wash up on the shore in drifts that look like red sand. They decompose in the heat. The bacteria that break them down release hydrogen sulfide gas. Scientifically, it's just decomposition, but mythologically, it feels like something else. Early explorers described the smell as the breath of a dead sea. It adds to the unease of the place. Saltair wasn't just a resort built on toxic mud. It was a resort built in a cloud of decay. You were dancing on a graveyard of billions of creatures. Chapter 12. Buried in Salt. But the salt doesn't just destroy, it preserves. The mud around the old Saltair pilings is a time capsule. The high salinity kills the bacteria that would normally rot wood or rust metal quickly. It pickles history. When the water recedes, it exposes the trash of the last century, but here, trash becomes treasure. Divers and mudlarkers have found plates from the Saltair dining hall stamped with the resort's logo. They find bathing caps. They find tokens for the rides. The most haunting discovery is the rail bed. The wooden ties of the old Saltair Railway are still there, buried just inches below the surface. You can trace the path of the ghost train for miles out into the desert. It is all still there, waiting. If you walk out onto the flats today, you are walking on top of the party. The laughter, the music, the spilled drinks, it's all frozen in the salt just beneath your boots. Chapter 13. The Spiral Jetty. Just north of Saltair, at Roselle Point, lies another monument to the strange power of this lake. In 1970, the same year the original Saltair burned to the ground, an artist named Robert Smithson hired dump trucks to move 6,000 tons of black basalt rock into the water. He built a spiral 1,500 feet long. He chose this spot specifically because of the desolation. He loved the red color of the water, caused by salt-loving microbes called halophiles, and the abandoned oil rigs rusting nearby. He called it the Spiral Jetty. Smithson was fascinated by entropy, the idea that everything moves from order to chaos. He wanted his art to collaborate with the lake, and it did. Just 2 years after he built it, the lake rose and swallowed the jetty. It vanished for 30 decades. When the drought brought it back in the early 2000s, it had changed. The black rocks were now white. The salt had encrusted every inch of the sculpture. It is the spiritual twin of Saltair. Saltair was built to defy the lake. The Spiral Jetty was built to surrender. Chapter 14. Nature's Reclamation. There is a violent beauty in how the lake reclaims things. The process is called nucleation. Salt crystals need something to hold on to, a branch, a dead bird, a piece of wire. Once the crystal forms, it grows geometrically. Leave a chair in the water, and in weeks it is a crystal throne. The lake claims everything it touches, turning ruin into sculpture. It smooths over the sharp edges, it bleaches the colors, it makes everything uniform. The fire blackened the wood of Saltair, the salt whitened it. It is a slow chemical digestion. The lake is eating the history of the resort, atom by atom. In 100 years, even the pilings will be gone. The iron bolts will be dust. The only thing left will be the salt itself. Chapter 15. The End of the Oasis. As the water line drops to historical lows, Saltair stands as a tombstone for a sea that might not exist in 50 years. We tried to tame the Great Salt Lake. We tried to commodify it. We built a palace on stilts and invited the world to float. But the lake never wanted to be a resort. It is a remnant of the Ice Age, a puddle left over from a time before humans walked this continent. It is indifferent to our fires, our roller coasters, and our nostalgia. The water is leaving, the arsenic is rising, the Coney Island of the West is now just a yellow shed on the edge of a toxic desert. We built a dream on the Dead Sea, and like all dreams, it woke up.